Good morning, I'm Tina Thomas, and this is a short presentation for Telling the Story of Business Symposium 2026, and I will be exploring transformation through parenthood. Hiding in my son's room. I should probably start by clarifying that although I found myself hiding in his room at Loughborough University, it isn't quite as creepy as it sounds. Like many parents, I assumed dropping my son off at university would be quite emotional. What I didn't expect was the overwhelming urge to stay hidden in his room. I found myself unpacking drawers that didn't need unpacking. I was rearranging things that were already arranged and generally finding reasons not to venture into the communal kitchen where students and parents were all introducing themselves. At the time, I assumed this was something to do with him leaving home, but actually it wasn't. What made me uncomfortable wasn't losing my son to university. It was discovering that somewhere along the line, I'd quietly lost a part of myself. And standing in one of the sportiest, or what I perceived to be the sportiest environments in the UK, surrounded by athletes, Olympians, and exceptionally fit 19 and 20-year-olds, I couldn't avoid seeing it anymore. So this presentation is therefore not a story about my son leaving home, it's a story about identity, and more specifically, how one uncomfortable afternoon at Loughborough University forced me to confront that reality and ultimately transform the way I saw myself. To understand why that moment affected me so deeply, I need to go back a little further. Sport has shaped almost every stage of my life. As a child, I loved competing, training, and belonging. It wasn't something I just did, it became part of who I was. During my Ironman years, if I'm completely honest, I felt invincible. And of course, identity doesn't develop in isolation, so if we think about parental socialisation, when my son arrived, sport became embedded in our family life, and we jokingly became known as Team Thomas. And I know that might sound slightly cringy, but for almost 20 years, sport shaped our weekends, our holidays, friendships, family routines. It was really part of our life. So looking back, I wasn't simply socialising him into sport. All of this led to building social capital. So he learned how to train, how to behave, and learn the language of sport, and perhaps, and more importantly, how to belong in that environment. So by the time he arrived at Loughborough University, he wasn't entering that world as an outsider, he very much belonged there. And if I'm honest, I think that's what I've spent the last 18 years trying to achieve. I think you'll probably get from this now that for decades my sport and identity was remarkably stable. That was until a series of disruptive events happened. I survived sepsis, I got through the isolation of COVID, I even survived a PhD. Yet none of those things fundamentally dismantled my athletic identity. A bad back did. One slightly clumsy misjudgment on my staircase led to a herniated disc, months of pain, or actually I probably would say years of pain, so it was at least 2 years, and it impacted me because I had a sudden withdrawal from the activities that had always helped me understand who I was. Looking back, it wasn't the injury itself, it was actually the inability to enact the identity that mattered. I couldn't train, I couldn't run, I couldn't ride, and actually, for a long time, it was very difficult to walk. And when your identity is deeply embedded, losing the ability to perform it can be profoundly disruptive. Eventually, I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognise the person looking back at me. And for the first time, my body felt visible to me. And once I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. And so we arrived back at Loughborough. My son got his keys, we carried boxes, filled cupboards, just like many parents across the UK in September. Yet I found myself hiding in his room and finding increasingly creative reasons not to venture back into the communal kitchen. At first, I assumed that was because he was leaving home, but that just didn't feel right to me. I wasn't upset. In fact, I was quite happy for him. I was looking forward to him, embarking upon his university student life. But what I actually realised is that I was uncomfortable. I was standing in what might be perceived as one of the sportiest environments in the UK, surrounded by athletes and Olympians, and I suddenly felt I no longer belonged. But don't get me wrong, this is not a story about vanity. The revelation wasn't that I was worried about how I looked for me, I was actually worried about how I reflected upon him. And looking back, some of you may be thinking, well, nobody was probably looking at you. And you're probably right, but the experience wasn't created by what people were actually thinking. It was created by what I thought they might be thinking. And in that moment, I realised something really unexpected. I wasn't trying to protect my own identity here, I was trying to protect his. And that was the moment that everything started to change. So what followed was a series of increasingly questionable decisions when I look back on them. I hired an online body transformation coach whose feedback seemed to consist entirely of fire emojis and strong arm emojis in some effort to try and encourage me. But needless to say, that relationship was short-lived. And then my husband suggested that we put something in the diary to train for. At the time, I did think it was an utterly ridiculous suggestion because I wasn't fit enough. I hadn't properly run, cycled or swam for over 2 years. And needless to say, I was apprehensive. But unfortunately, or fortunately, as soon as our son suggested joining us, I was straight in. That was it. I was signed up. Sign me up. So we signed up for Ironman 70.3 Zell am See in Austria later this year. I panicked at that point, and shortly afterwards I chose a Loughborough trained personal trainer, and for some reason, I don't know why, I booked Everest Base Camp for the three of us too. None of these decisions emerged because I was fit. None of them emerged because I felt capable. The transformation started long before any evidence existed to support my ability to do these things. What was interesting is what changed first was my identity. And perhaps most importantly, my son never told me to do any of this. I think I raised him far too politely to comment on a woman's weight. The influence emerged instead through our relationship, and the direction it influenced had simply just changed. So this brings me to the theory, really. As I reflected on my experience, I realised something didn't quite fit with existing discussions of reverse socialisation that I'd come across in my PhD. Traditionally, reverse socialisation describes situations where children influence their parents. And that influence is usually quite visible. You can see it. So they introduce their parents to new technologies, the use of smartphones, for example, influencing purchasing decisions, which can relate to any kind of purchasing decision within the home, or encouraging environmental or health behaviours. Or they could encourage parents to engage with new products, services, or activities. There's a whole range of things, but these are quite visible. But that isn't what happened here with me. My son never told me to lose weight. He never encouraged me to train, and he never suggested signing up for a personal trainer. And he never sat me down initially and said, "Mum, have you considered entering another Ironman race and trekking to Everest Base Camp?" I think that would have been quite deeply concerning if he had. Instead, the influence emerged indirectly through our relationship, through a shared family identity, very much through my desire to protect and align myself with a sport and identity that I had spent years helping to create. So the existing literature tends to focus on what children do. But what this experience suggests is influence may also emerge through what relationships actually mean. In other words, the mechanism isn't direct persuasion. It's symbolic connection, it's identity, and it's belonging. And perhaps most importantly, it's the desire to protect something that we've invested ourselves in. Because my son, as part of our team Thomas, is inextricably linked to my identity. So what began as an uncomfortable afternoon at Loughborough ultimately led me to think about how I can extend the idea of reverse socialisation. So the influence wasn't behavioural at first, it was relational first, and the behaviour came afterwards. So lots of race entries, personal trainer, lifestyle changes, these were all consequences of a deeper identity shift that had already begun. So for me, I think this is the contribution. Sometimes transformation doesn't occur because someone tells us to change. Sometimes it happens because relationships continue to shape who we are long after we think the direction of influence has stopped. So finally, I'd like to finish by returning to that room in Loughborough. At the time, I thought the problem was that I wasn't the person I used to be. For a long time, I assumed the solution was to become Ironman Tina again. But somewhere during this process, I realised I'd been asking the wrong question. So I shouldn't have been asking myself, how do I get back to who I was? But actually, who do I want to become next? And the more I reflect, the more I realise I wasn't actually trying to recover my old identity at all. What emerged was somebody quite different. I still love sport, I still love a challenge, and I still sign up for things before properly considering the consequences. But I no longer feel the need to be the athlete that I was at 40. When I was hiding in the room at Loughborough, I thought that I was witnessing my son's transition to university. What I didn't realise at the time was that I was actually standing right in the middle of my own. Thank you for listening.